Today I'm going to take you to a place where the supernatural isn't just a story, but a terrifying and silent presence that lurks in the shadows of the night. Before we dive into this story, I ask that you like and subscribe to the channel. Your support is essential for us to continue exploring the deepest and most disturbing mysteries. Now turn off the lights, take a deep breath, and get ready for a story that will challenge everything you think you know about fear. What I'm going to tell you is real, and once you hear it, there's no going back. It was a rainy night when Marcos and his wife, Carla, decided to take a shortcut along an unfamiliar road to get to a friend's house faster. The heavy rain made it difficult to see, and the GPS was failing. After several kilometers, they realized they were on a dirt road, surrounded by tall, dark trees. Suddenly, something crossed the front of the car. Marcos tried to swerve, but the car skidded and crashed violently into a tree. When he regained consciousness, he noticed that Carla was not in the car. Desperate, he went out to look for her. He screamed her name, but the only answer was the sound of the rain. The car's light illuminated something strange on the road, a figure standing motionless, with wet clothes and a blank, fixed gaze. As he approached, Marcos froze in horror. It was Carla, but with a deformed face and a hole in her chest where her heart should have been. Before he could react, she whispered, "You shouldn't have come this way. Now we're stuck forever." Marcos was never found. They say that on rainy nights you can hear desperate screams on that road, coming from a car that never left. Ricardo was returning home after a long work trip. It was late at night and he was starting to feel tired. He decided to stop at a deserted gas station to rest a little. After filling up the tank, he sat in the car and, before starting it, he noticed a figure sitting in the back seat in the rearview mirror. It was a pale man, with sunken eyes and a disturbing smile. "Can I give you a ride?" the stranger asked. Frightened, Ricardo tried to get out of the car, but the doors were locked. The man leaned forward and, in a cold voice, said, "You're not going anywhere without me." The car's engine started by itself, and Ricardo was forced to drive along deserted roads, with the stranger dictating the route. Every time he tried to stop or ask for help, the man threatened his life. After hours of terror, the car finally stopped on a cliff. "Now it's your turn to take me home," the man said, pointing to the abyss. The next morning, Ricardo's car was found at the bottom of the cliff, but his body was missing. To this day, drivers report seeing a car driving out of control on nearby roads, always with a mysterious passenger in the back seat. Luana always avoided driving at night, but that Friday she had no choice. She was returning from a party when, as she passed a dangerous curve known for being the scene of many accidents, she saw an overturned car on the side of the road. Thinking that it was recent and that someone needed help, she stopped and got out. As she approached, she noticed that there was no one inside the car, but she felt a presence around her. Suddenly, she heard whispers coming from all directions. Looking back, she saw a family standing on the road, wearing old clothes and empty eyes. They began to scream desperately for help, reaching out to her. Luana ran to the car, but before she could get in, the doors locked. Spirits surrounded the car and the lights began to flash. Desperate, Luana closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, she was alone on the road. The overturned car had disappeared. Later, she discovered that the family had died on that curve years ago, in an accident that was never solved. Since then, Luana has avoided that road, but on full moon nights, she still hears the cries for help from the dead. Carlos was driving late one night, returning from visiting a friend, when the car radio turned on by itself, emitting a strange hissing sound. He tried to turn it off, but the button seemed to be stuck. Suddenly, a familiar voice began to speak. It was that of his brother, Enrique, who had died in a car accident years before. "Carlos, I'm stuck here. Go back to the place where I died," the voice said. Carlos felt a chill run down his spine, but the urge to obey was irresistible. He drove to the site of the accident, a sharp and dangerous curve. When he arrived, the car stopped by itself. The radio continued to transmit Henrique's voice, now full of pain and despair. "I didn't want to die, Carlos. Help me get out of here," the voice begged. Carlos got out of the car and started looking for something, but there was nothing there. Suddenly, a thick fog covered the road, and Carlos felt invisible hands pushing him towards the cliff. Struggling to free himself, he slipped and fell, but miraculously, he got caught on a branch. When he looked up, he saw the deformed face of his brother, who whispered, "Now you are trapped too." The next morning, they found Carlos's car abandoned on the side of the road, but he was never seen again. They say that on foggy nights, Henrique's voice can still be heard echoing around that bend. Gabriela was returning from a party when her car started to stall in the middle of a deserted road. With no cell phone signal and no gas stations nearby, she went out to try to find help. As she walked, she saw a dark stain on the asphalt ahead. As she got closer, she realized it was blood, forming a trail that led to the shoulder. Curious and scared, she followed the trail, which ended at a tree with marks from a violent impact. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. When she turned around, she saw a bloody man, with half of his face destroyed, walking towards her. He was mumbling something that Gabriela could not understand. Terrified, she ran back to the car, but when she got there, the man was sitting in the driver's seat, smiling macabrely. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, before disappearing into thin air. Desperate, Gabriela tried to start the car, but it wouldn't start. When she finally managed to get the engine to start, something grabbed her steering wheel, forcing her to drive towards the tree where the trail ended. At the last second, he managed to jump out of the car before it crashed violently. It was later discovered that the man was a driver who had died on that road years before. They say he still roams the area, waiting for new victims to take them to the same fate as he did. Flavio and his friends were driving back from a concert, laughing and having fun in the car, when they decided to take a shortcut to a country road. The night was shrouded in thick fog, making it difficult to see more than a few meters ahead. Along the way, they began to see crosses along the roadside, each with wilted flowers and unlit candles. "I don't think we should be here," one of the friends said, but the others laughed and ignored the warning. A few kilometers later, the road began to look strangely familiar, as if they were driving in circles. Panic began to take hold of the group when, suddenly, the car began to lose power until it stopped completely. As Flavio tried to start the car, the headlights illuminated something terrible. Shadowy, distorted figures emerged from the fog, all with expressions of pain and despair. They banged on the windows, asking to be freed, but their voices were only incomprehensible murmurs. Flavio finally managed to start the car and sped down the road, but the figures began to multiply, appearing in front and around them, blocking the way. The group screamed as the car passed them, feeling the impact as if they had run over something. When they finally emerged from the fog, the figures disappeared, and the road seemed normal again. When they arrived in the city, they told the police about their experience, who revealed that the road was known as the Road of the Damned, where many had died in mysterious accidents. Those who survived the journey were never the same again, as if something had been left behind on that road. Julia was a ride-sharing driver who was finishing her night shift when she received a request for a ride in a remote area. Even though she was tired, she accepted the ride and followed the GPS instructions. When she arrived at the location, a deserted street surrounded by trees, she stopped in front of an old, poorly lit house. A tall, hooded man got into the car without saying a word and sat in the back seat. Julia tried to start a conversation, but he remained silent. The GPS showed a strange destination, a road she had never heard of. As she drove, she noticed in the rearview mirror that the man had no face, just a smooth, pale surface where his eyes, nose, and mouth should be. Terrified, she began to tremble, but she didn't know what to do. When they finally arrived at their destination, a deserted, dark road, the man got out of the car without saying anything and disappeared into the darkness. Julia, trembling, decided to get out of there as quickly as possible, but the car wouldn't start. Looking around, she realized she was surrounded by hooded figures, all faceless. She tried to get out, but the doors were locked. The figures began to approach, banging on the car and trying to get in. With a scream, Julia closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, she was in the middle of the city, the car running normally. There was no sign of where she had been before, but when she checked her ride history, the last request simply didn't exist. Julia never accepted night rides again. Felipe was driving along a deserted road late at night when his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but he answered it anyway. On the other end of the line, a tearful female voice begged for help. "Please, you have to help me. I'm stuck. My car has overturned." Felipe was confused, but the voice sounded so desperate that he decided to follow her instructions. The woman described a place that he recognized as a dangerous curve on that road. When he got there, he saw a car overturned on the side of the road exactly as she had described. He ran to the vehicle, but there was no one inside. Not understanding, he called emergency services and explained the situation. While he waited for help to arrive, the phone rang again. It was the same number. "Why did you abandon me? Don't go away, I'm stuck here," said the voice, now full of desperation and anger. Felipe, frightened, looked around, but there was no one else. Suddenly, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. Turning around, he saw a woman with a disfigured face, covered in blood, looking at him with hatred. "You left me to die here, and now you're going to keep me company." Terrified, Felipe tried to run, but his feet seemed glued to the ground. The ambulance sirens were getting closer, but he couldn't move. The last thing he saw was the woman approaching, before everything went dark. When the paramedics arrived, they found only the overturned car, but Felipe was nowhere to be found. Only his phone was found on the ground, with a last call made to an unknown number with no call log. Camilla was driving home from a party when she decided to take an unfamiliar shortcut to avoid traffic. The road was narrow and poorly lit, surrounded by trees that formed a kind of natural tunnel. As she drove, she noticed that her car was behaving strangely, as if something was pulling her to the side. Suddenly, a thick fog enveloped the road, and her headlights could barely penetrate the darkness. Camilla tried to turn on her high beams, but they failed. The road ahead seemed to never end, and she began to feel a growing sense of panic. Then she saw a figure at the side of the road, a woman in a white dress soaked by the rain. Camilla stopped to offer help, but the woman disappeared as she approached. Frightened, she got back in the car and tried to drive faster, but it seemed like the road was stretching on forever. When she finally found a point where the road seemed to fork, Camilla chose a path and drove for a few more minutes until she was out of the fog. When she got home, she discovered that the GPS had recorded a route 50 kilometers further than normal. When she looked out the window, she saw the same woman in the white dress standing in front of her house with a blank and terrifying look in her eyes. Camilla never took unfamiliar shortcuts again. Leonardo was driving alone on a country road when his car started making a strange noise. He stopped to check it out, but found nothing wrong. When he got back into his car, he noticed something was different. His rearview mirror was covered in white powder, as if someone had recently touched it. As he drove again, he began to hear whispers coming from the rearview mirror, but when he looked, there was no one there. The sound seemed to be coming from inside the car, growing louder and more distressing. The whispers were like a conversation in an unknown language, but with a desperate tone. Suddenly, the car began to accelerate on its own, and Leonardo saw a figure in the rearview mirror, a blurry shadow with glowing, angry eyes. The car seemed out of control, hurtling toward a cliff. With great effort, he managed to swerve and stop the car a few meters from the edge. When he looked in the rearview mirror again, the figure disappeared and the noise stopped. However, the rearview mirror was broken and the white powder had disappeared. Leonardo was never able to explain what happened, but whenever he drives, he avoids looking in the rearview mirror. Mariana was returning from a business trip and decided to take a shortcut along a country road that crossed a crossroads known for being the site of several strange accidents. As she drove, an uneasy feeling began to grow, as if she were being watched. When she reached the crossroads, her car suddenly stopped. She tried to start the engine, but it would not start. Suddenly, she heard a voice from the other side of the road, calling her name. She turned to look, but there was no one there. When she turned back, she saw a car approaching at an alarming speed, as if in a blur. In desperation, she tried to get out of the car and drive away, but the car headed straight for her. At the last moment, the car disappeared, and Mariana fell to the ground. When she got up, she saw a sign at the crossroads with a strange inscription. Here, destinies intersect. The next morning, she discovered that other drivers had reported similar experiences at that crossroads. Since then, Mariana has avoided that road, fearing that their own destinies might cross again. Felipe was driving after a long day at work and decided to stop on a country road to get some rest. He parked the car and closed his eyes for a moment. When he woke up, he felt a chill run down his spine and realized that the car was surrounded by thick fog. When he looked outside, he saw that the road had completely changed. Instead of the normal road, there was an old racetrack with old, rusty cars speeding past. The sound of the engines was deafening, and the cars seemed to run in endless circles. Felipe tried to start the car to get out of there, but the engine would not start. The cars on the track continued to pass by, ignoring his vehicle. He saw a figure in the middle of the track, a man in a racing uniform, who approached him and said, "This is where the racers get stuck." With a final effort, Felipe managed to start the car and get out of the fog. When he got home, he discovered that he had been parked on that road all night. The car was covered in dust and looked like it had been used in a race. Since then, he has avoided any stops on back roads, fearing being dragged into another ghost race. Na was driving to a nearby town and decided to take a back road to shorten the journey. As she drove, she noticed that the weather was changing rapidly, with dark clouds forming in the sky. Suddenly, she began to hear a wailing coming from outside the car. Startled, she tried to identify the source of the sound, but she could see nothing through the fogged-up windows. The road was empty, and the feeling that something was watching her grew stronger by the minute. The wailing seemed to intensify, as if someone were crying desperately. As Anna turned a corner, she saw a car parked on the side of the road, with a woman inside, crying inconsolably. As Anna approached, the woman raised her head and looked directly at her, revealing a face covered in tears and blood. "They wouldn't let me go," she whispered, before disappearing. Anna sped off the road as quickly as she could. When she got home, she discovered that there had been no recent reports of accidents on that road, but the wailing still haunts her, causing her to avoid driving in isolated places at night.